This series of podcasts on domestic violence during the pandemic in Sri Lanka is an initiative by the Centre for Equality and Justice in collaboration with the Forum Against Gender-Based Violence.
Welcome to the first episode of series of podcast on domestic violence during the pandemic. I'm Lechumanan Kamaleswari, Senior Program Officer at the Centre for Equality and Justice. I would like to welcome Tyagi Piyadasa on behalf of CEJ. Tyagi Piyadasa is a human rights lawyer, researcher, and development practitioner with over 15 years of experience. Tyagi also BA Honours in International Relations from the University of Colombo, LLB from Open University of Sri Lanka, and is currently reading for her Masters in International Human Rights Law at the University of Oxford. Thank you for joining us today, Tyagi. So I would like to start the conversation by asking, during the COVID-19 pandemic, is there an increase in sexual and gender-based violence? If yes, what are the most prevalent types of cases?
Thank you so much for having me, Kamali, first of all. Yes, to answer your question, there was an increase in sexual and gender-based violence in Sri Lanka. And the reasons for this is because, we always had, several incidents of sexual and gender-based violence. But the reasons that made it worse during the pandemic was primarily because people were, because of the lockdown, people were forced to stay at home. Very often, as a result, if it's cases of domestic violence, this meant that the woman or the victim was at home with the perpetrator, right? Secondly, there were also instances where, for example, children were left at home when the parents were quarantined. So, at the early stages, if you would recall, there weren't proper protocols for quarantine. Parents would be quarantined, mothers would be quarantined, and children would be left, uncared for. So there were various reasons that made particularly children and women vulnerable to violence. Similarly, there was also, I think, a lot of stress during COVID, right? Like, so for example, people lost their jobs, their income. There was also a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of stigma surrounding, COVID. So overall, there was also a sense of increased frustration and anxiety, and people didn't really know how to sort of cope. So all of this kind of increased the tendency to use violence, especially within the household. So definitely there were several, I think, incidents of domestic violence, like an increase in domestic violence. Hotlines like the 1938 state hotline, for example, recorded an increased number of calls related to DV. Women in Need also said that there was an increased number, as well as, I think, the accident service of the National Hospital, where, I think the head nurse said that if they'd received 100 cases,
it has increased.
At least 10 were incidents of domestic violence. So there was definitely an increase in domestic violence. As well as sort of violations regarding, rape and sexual harassment of women and children.
Okay, so the 2019 Women Wellbeing Survey in Sri Lanka states that 20 to 70% of Sri Lanka women experience domestic violence. This is prior to the pandemic. So definitely there's an increase during the pandemic. Though the cases have increased, not the complaint. That was the quote in the CEJ study we have mentioned. So why? I would like to know why there's no proper complaint when it made. How women cope up with being with the abusive partners. So I would like to know a bit more about on that complaint.
Okay. So I think the situation is that, as I said before, because, and especially in an emergency, so not just COVID, but even if it's an emergency related to, like, say, conflict, for example, what happens is that the support structures collapse, right? So, for example, in Sri Lanka, courts closed, police were deployed for other COVID-related duties.
Mitigation.
So they were not able to, focus on other police duties, like, for example, accepting complaints. Similarly, people couldn't travel, right? So, I mean, if you were a survivor of domestic violence, transport was limited, right? So, as a result, it wasn't easy to make a complaint. You needed some other type of support. So, very often, women would call. Sometimes women would directly call, the 119 hotline. There were instances, I think, in Hambantota where the children would call the police, and
Because
say there's a problem at home. But very often police say that actually it was neighbors that reported violence, right? So they would overhear an incident and they would report it to the police. There were also instances where, in locations where there was good relationship built between the community and also state officers, like
providers.
the Women's Development Officer, then, or the Gramaldari, women would directly also try and communicate to them. And then they would link with the service providers. But also, I think local women's rights groups played a huge role. I think they really supported women through, again, mobile phones, because there was no way you could access physically. But at least through the mobile phones, women were able to kind of reach out. So this is why there was a, though there was an increase in incidents of violence, there weren't as many complaints. Also because it was just difficult. But also, I must say, I think in Anuradhapura, and a lot of doctors said this, there's also a certain stigma about complaining.
That was the follow-up question I wanted to ask.
There's definitely stigma in reporting domestic violence. And shame, because, the idea is that you need to bear this up. It's a private matter that you shouldn't really complain. And I think during COVID, the other reason why people were also very scared to complain was because they felt that, the husband would be arrested. They were not sure where he would be kept. There was this fear of contracting COVID. So there was a lot of stigma also about COVID, in addition to the stigma of making a complaint of domestic violence, right? So, so there were also other factors like, the cultural sensitivities and this sense that women need to somehow bear it up, right? That's a very prevalent idea in Sri Lanka and also globally. So for these reasons, women were not as likely to come forward and report.
So you said that women's organization played a huge role by supporting women to make complaints through mobile phones. How did the police reacted, or how did they took the complaint from the victims or victim representatives or the stakeholders? What was the role the police officers play?
So, as I said before, in many cases, the police were actually understaffed, right? Because they were assigned for additional duties related to quarantine. And so there was a shortage of police. So there have been mixed reports, right? So for example, many women's organizations and also the research by, your organization, CEJ, stated that many times police would just ask the woman to go back home, right, to the perpetrator, simply because they just didn't have the resources to take on that case, right? So that was definitely one issue. But there have also been instances, say, for example, in Anuradhapura, where in certain divisions, the police, together with the Gramaldari, together with the Women's Development Officer, were able to kind of go to villages. So wherever there were complaints that they received through, the hotline, they would go to the village and then they would try and see what can be done, right? So it's not to say that there was no positive response, but by and large, the police were unable to actually accommodate all the complaints that were coming in. This was a mix of, as I said, sort of the social element of, not wanting to entertain domestic violence complaints because they feel it's a private matter, but also because there were very serious resource constraints, right? So in many cases, police also didn't have transport, right? And not just police, even other government officers didn't have transport. And I believe during the lockdown period, many officers were working with only like 1/3 of their staff. So this meant that there was insufficient human resource to also adequately respond to the increasing numbers of complaints.
So shall we talk a bit on the shelter services in Sri Lanka? According to the research again, in 9 provinces there are shelter services, but mostly are run by CSOs. So during pandemic, with the limited resources, how these shelter centers were able to support women?
So yes, we don't have nearly as many shelters as we need in Sri Lanka. And I think, there was a recent study by UNFPA that identified 21 shelters, but that's in total with regard to sort of childcare centers and
also
shelters.
run by government and also by
Yes.
civil society.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think even at the moment, there are certain shelters that are supported by government to some extent, but yes, we definitely need more shelters in Sri Lanka. So during the pandemic, actually, a lot of the shelters had to rely on, existing relationships with the police, with other sort of entities, just to get basic necessities. Like, for example, milk powder. There was one shelter that had, over 15 infants, right? And shelter staff couldn't travel, as well as they were not able to get transport to also, access emergency like medical services. So in situations like that, the shelters were really quite vulnerable, and they had to rely on sort of existing relationships, like with the police, with the local government, but also well-wishers, like pharmacies and things like that, just to source basic necessities, for the children in their care.
What would be your recommendation to improve the services of shelter centers? I don't think that we should make recommendation to the civil society. They are already doing enough of.
Yeah.
What is your recommendation to the government entities?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely we need proper resourcing, right? For example, there should be at least one shelter in each district, because especially at the time of an emergency, travel is one of the first things to be restricted. And then we know now, right? Like, imagine if it was happening now, where we didn't have fuel and we couldn't travel, that would be disastrous. Yeah. So I definitely feel that the Ministry of Women's Affairs has to identify and prioritize certain essential services for GBV, and to have a fund, that is mandatory. And so then that fund can be contributed, like, the UN and other agencies can also contribute to that fund. Yeah. But I feel the state must allocate some funding for that and ensure that there's a shelter in every district, because that's a priority.
Or maybe more than one for every district.
Exactly. I mean, and again, I think this is where data comes into play. I think, the state really needs to also, work with the police, work with the hospitals, and try and identify districts that have an increased reporting of GBV, and ensure that those districts have, more services. Especially, like, for example, if it's a district like Anuradhapura, it's a large district. So one shelter is not enough. You might actually need about 2 or 3 shelters. So
based on number of cases also,
exactly,
right?
Exactly.
I just want to know, maybe we can talk more about the not the support services. Our CSOs were also supporting women during the pandemic. Were there any special or the best practices that CSOs had during the pandemic in order to get women to make more reporting, or to report more, or get more support from others? Were there any best practices locally? We can talk a lot on international. You can give us some example and then come to Sri Lanka.
So I think locally, women's rights organizations and civil society played a huge role. So one of the first things that they did is that, for example, Women in Need, they increased the hotlines, right? So they made sure that there were several hotlines in Sinhala and Tamil, so that, and they publicized this on social media, through WhatsApp, Facebook, and also the newspapers. And I think that was one way in which, they kind of got that information out there on who you can contact, at least to get information. Similarly, the state also, I think, they increased the hotline to a 24-hour hotline, which I think was very useful. In addition, I think a lot of civil society and women's rights organizations also went on media, like on radio and TV. They had interviews, knowledge sharing events, so that people who are listening would at least, get this information. But also, I think they use their local networks. So what I mean by that is, a lot of these organizations have sort of societies at a village level. and by word of mouth. So again, through the phone, they would be able to check up on each other and make sure that, if there is a incident, then they would coordinate among each other to see how they can best respond.
I also would like to discuss something about the signal for help. That was in some other countries that they use the signal for help to, for the domestic violence victim. Do you think something like that would work in Sri Lanka? Can we adapt, or we should find something new for the context?
I mean, I think it would work. So I think in Argentina, they had the red mask, signal. So for example, if you go to a pharmacy and you ask for a red mask, they would know that, you needed help, and they would automatically, contact the hotline. So, I mean, in Sri Lanka, it could work. But again, I think the problem is that you need to make sure that there is also, you are able to meet the demand, right? So I think the problem that Sri Lanka faced was that you had this massive number of complaints, even though it was not as much as, we anticipated, there was still a lot, and we couldn't really meet that demand, right?
Okay.
So you need to make sure that, the police are able to visit, to take down a complaint, to investigate, to, bring the case to court, that court would function, that court would have digital hearings. So there's a lot of things that need to happen to ensure that you are able to meet the demand. Without that infrastructure, it's very dangerous to, I think, give hope, because you have to make sure that if you're asking people to come to you, that you're able to help them.
So we should have enough resources.
Absolutely.
Basically,
Yeah.
So the final question, I'm going to read it out. That's okay, right?
Yes.
Because, so what are the preparedness and responsive plans that should be implemented by the government entities providing services for DV victims to respond to a future pandemic or emergency situation? That's my final question.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing is to definitely recognize that services relating to sexual and gender-based violence should be considered essential services at a time, at a pandemic or at any emergency, right? That is really important. So, for example, even with courts, urgent matters were heard, but urgent matters were mainly bail hearings and not domestic violence complaints. So, for example, in Argentina, what they did is that they automatically extended protection orders during periods of lockdown. So survivors didn't have to come to court just to get that order extended, that they would automatically extend the protection order, right? So that is one thing. The second thing would be that you need to be able to, you call it surge, where you pump in extra resources, pump in extra staff to make sure that, services are provided. So for example, the 1938 hotline, extended it 24 hours, right? So they recruited extra people, made sure that it was running for 24 hours. And then, there are situations where you need to also amend laws fairly fast. So for example, digital hearings, but also ensure that those digital hearings extend to cases of sexual and gender-based violence, right? So for example, in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, DV was not really ever heard through digital hearings, right? So that can be improved. Then you also need to have like good coordination between government, firstly within government bodies, and secondly between government bodies and civil society, right? It's really important because you realize at a time of emergency that one party can't do everything, right? So it's really important that they coordinate, that they have a good relationship. And this means that you need to build these relationships before an emergency, right? I think that's really important.
Thank you very much, Tyagi. Thank you for joining us today. So that's the end for the first episode. Those who are watching or listening the podcast can wait till the end of this episode to know the hotline numbers. Thank you.